The Ransom of Mercy Carter, Chapter 2. Deerfield, Massachusetts, February 29th, 1704, temperature 0 degrees. Eban Nims was last in the line of captives that straggled across the fields and up into the hills. The Indians had strapped a heavy pack to his back, its weight supported by a belt across his forehead. Wrapped in the quilt his grandmother had made in England, where his mother's stew pot and china bowls, his sister's dolls, his father's gun, and his brother-in-law's Bible. There were boots and a whole ham, powder and shot, and yesterday's bread. Eban would not have to part with his family's possessions. He himself would carry them to Canada. Next to him, Mercy Carter's stepmama could not even carry her own baby. Terrified beyond thought or action, she skittered aimlessly in the snow, mewing like the infant she held. Eban tried to take the baby for her, but so quickly that she could not have known what was happening. She and her baby were disposed of. Eban even understood why it was done. She would not have made it over the first mountain. Please stop here and answer question 1. So these were the border wars, where the French sent their tame Indians to slaughter English settlers. The taking of so many children would strike horror into the heart of every frontier mother and father. Farms and villages would be abandoned. The settlements would return to wilderness. The New World would be French and not English. But in spite of shock and fear, Eban Nims rejoiced. He had saved his 3 little sisters, twins Molly and Mary, age 5, hair of gold and eyes of blue, and Hitty, the picky, feisty 7-year-old Eban loved best. By the time Eban had been awakened by gunfire, already the sleepers downstairs were trying to find and load weapons and trying to hold the heavy front door against the Indians, who were smashing the lock with their hatchets and throwing their weight against the hinges. Eban tore his little sisters from their bed, carrying all 3 in his arms and leaping down the steep stairs. He yanked up the trap door to the shallow cellar where the food was stored and lowered the girls into the dark. Are you coming too, Eban? Begged Molly, who was afraid of spiders. I'll be up here fighting. Stay quiet. Soon the attack will be over and I'll get you out. Eban slammed the trapdoor down and their terrified eyes vanished from his sight. He kicked bedrolls over the telltale cracks in the floorboards, and the Indians smashed through the front door and were inside the house. Eban prepared to fight to the death. Help would come too late for him, but his sisters would be found. The settlers had experience. They knew to check cellars. Eban had no weapon but a frying pan, which he used as violently as the Indians used their tomahawks. Frenchmen poured into the house. Eban was so astonished to see the French that the pan slipped from his grasp. The French did not do their own fighting. The whole point of Indian allies was to be sure that the Indians took all the risk. Before he could launch his fists, an Indian thrust a knife into his chest. Eban gave his soul to the Lord, but when the blade had penetrated half an inch, the Indian used it to prod Eban out of the house. Eban willed Molly and Mary and Hitty to stay silent until the men of neighboring towns spotted fire in the northern sky and came to the rescue. Running 2 fingers through his own dark, red grease paint, the Indian marked Eban's forehead. Why was he alive? Had it been so crowded in the house that they did not know Eban had killed one of them? Or did they know well, and did this mark him out for torture later? Please stop here and answer question 2. Mercy pulled her sister along while she carried Daniel, and then she carried Marah and hauled Daniel. Jemima did not help. Ruth, whose lungs got worse in cold weather, was wheezing. Mercy knew the hill they were climbing. It was the view from her bedroom window. Long since stripped of trees, because the settlers needed so much wood for building and for fires, the hills around Deerfield had no covering now but grass. To get trees big enough to repair the stockade, the men had to venture 3 or 4 miles from the village. In wartime, it was too dangerous. The very trees they needed to cut down in order to build safety were the trees behind which the Indians lurked. Mother had loved this hill. She used to run up, shooing the boys ahead of her, holding Mercy's hand, saying, "In a moment, Mercy, we'll see the Lord's land, the land he gave us, waiting for an English axe and an English hand." Mother would throw back her head and laugh delightedly at the sight of wilderness stretching north, ready to be tamed and used as the Lord meant it, instead of wasted on Indians. "Look!" cried Jemima. "Mercy, turn around! The men of Hadley are coming! We'll be saved!" Mercy did not want to slow down. The Indians were letting prisoners rest once they reached the top, but she did fling one glance over her shoulder and, sure enough, the flames in the sky must have alerted the watch in Hadley. From the south came men on horseback, dozens of them. Jemima was laughing and hugging herself. "They'll kill those Indians," she said smugly. "They'll slaughter those French." But Mercy knew too well that Indians were always ready for a second stand. "Don't look," she told herself. "It's better not to know." She looked. The ambush was ready. She could see it from where she stood. The men of Hadley might kill some Indians, but they themselves would soon be killed. Mercy could jump up and down and scream a warning, but the rescuers would not see her against the glare. And if they did, they wouldn't recognize a warning. They'd run faster to save her. Mercy hoisted Daniel and Marah one on each hip and climbed up, feet sideways in the snow to get a purchase on the slippery tilt. At the top of the hill she set them down. Her knees were trembling and her ankles hurt from being skewed around. When she lowered her exhausted arms, she wanted to cry along with Marah. Jemima and Ruth had halted to enjoy the rescue. Ruth was clapping while Jemima waved her hat and scarf. The French vanished over the snow and across the brook in the opposite direction from a hill up where the prisoners floundered. A few Indians were gathering the last plunder when the men of Hadley galloped up. A great cheer rose from the Deerfielders still fighting. It was a stirring sound, as full of joy as shouted "Amen." Jemima forgot her fear, and Ruth forgot her anger, and they too cheered. Tears wet Mercy's face as she watched. From the besieged houses the surviving English poured out. There was no pause. The men of Hadley rode right past the stockade, while the men of Deerfield raced on foot after them, hoisting long, dark flintlock muskets. "Don't go after the Indians," she prayed. "Stay where you are." But nothing would stop this pursuit. The English would hurl themselves against the enemy to get 100 captives back. Mercy held Marah and Daniel tight against her so they could not watch. The Indians pulled back, coaxing the pursuit farther. One Indian was shot down, body twisting and arms flailing, and another great cheer came from the English. Then the French exploded out of the trees, and the Indians stepped from a cleft in the snow. Sunlight caught the snow, and the world took an odd pewtery shine, and Ruth's brother, marked out by the persimmon-dyed cap Ruth had knitted him last fall, was the first one killed in the meadow. Please stop here and answer question 3. The last to reach the top of the hill, Eban supported the heavy burden by tucking his hands behind him so he could straighten a little and look back. The English flag blew in a light wind, as if it did not know or care that its sons and daughters had died. Eban's house was burning. In spite of its heavy covering of snow, the wood-shingled roof had caught fire. The fire was melting the snow, but snow melt was not putting out the fire. A window fell in, crackled by heat, and flames leapt out. For a moment the flames were small and yellow, and then something caught, ammunition perhaps, or grease in a pan by the hearth. Spires of orange and scarlet shrieked from the house, and smoke blackened the snow. The men of Hadley died in the meadow, and Eban Nims died in his heart. Molly and Mary and Hitty would be silent forever now. Please stop here and answer question 4. The captives had not rested 5 minutes when the Indians moved them on. The French did not join them, nor were they visible. Those glorious uniforms and startling swords might have been swallowed by the frozen river. The prisoners went down the other side of the hill, and Deerfield vanished. They could neither see their home nor smell it burn because the wind was blowing the other way and the smoke stayed behind. Ahead of them, snow sparkled rose and gold and the sun shone bright. A few Indians walked first, trampled out a path, while the prisoners trudged in single file after them. There were about 20 adult men, tied at the wrists and elbows. Around their necks were leather collars with 2 leashes, one held by the Indian in front, the other by the Indian behind. And about the same number of grown women walked alone because the Indians weren't letting husbands walk with their wives. The mothers were stunned and heartsick, and above all, slow. It was frightening to see their fathers treated like dogs and their mothers without hope. The children kept to themselves. Mercy's leg throbbed, Daniel got heavier, and Marah would not stop crying. Eliza walked fast enough but had to be guided in the right direction. She didn't say anything about what had happened to her husband Andrew, and nobody else said anything either. In fact, nobody talked. Jemima cried as much as Marah, wailing for the rescue that had failed. Ruth's lungs were as noisy as the crunching of snow. They crossed field after field, the Indians constantly demanding more speed. Mercy did not know why the Indians were in such a hurry. They had killed anybody who would chase them. Eban had fallen a number of times, and this time, when he struggled to his feet, the huge pack on his back had shifted and he could not balance himself. An Indian saw and came over to adjust the straps. Eban had not thought he could tell one Indian from another, but he recognized the two-finger smear in the man's red face paint. It was grease paint. Eban could smell the rancid fat. The sight of his house burning had turned him into a mere collection of muscle, a tool to carry and lift, a body that would make a good slave. He supposed that was the purpose of taking so many prisoners. Slavery. The mark on his forehead must be the mark of ownership. He, Eban Nims, had ceased to be a free Englishman. He was Indian property. 100 paces ahead, Ruth Catlin turned and saw how close to Eban the Indian stood. She had been raging anyhow, and when her brother was shot in the meadow, her rage intensified. "Kill him, Eb!" shouted Ruth Catlin. "Just kill him! They're all murderers!" Eban could hear Ruth, and understand Ruth, and even agree with Ruth. He was in a position to seize the hatchet, but there was no fight in him. He followed the Indian. Please stop here and answer question 5. The pace was relentless. This was not a walk, it was a march. Like soldiers, they must take another step. They did not walk in rhythm, nor was there a drum like the one used to call people to meeting. Instead, there was the shining edge of a sharp blade which surpassed any drumbeat in its demands. Mercy could not keep up the pace. Gradually, the line passed by her until she was walking with Eban Nims, and she must not fall farther behind than that, because the Indians behind Eban were the last of the line. Daniel held tight and sucked his thumb. But not only did Marah refuse to walk, she kept yelling that her feet were cold, and she wanted stepmama, and she needed her mittens, and she was hungry. Mercy could walk, though not fast enough, and she could carry, though not easily, but she could not supply food, warmth, or stepmama. Mercy tried to believe that stepmama was up ahead of her with the baby, but it was so crowded and chaotic, Mercy could not spot her. But in her heart, she did not think stepmama had left the stockade. "The savage put food in my pack, Mercy," said Eban quietly. "If you slip your hand into the opening near my left shoulder, there's a loaf of bread on top." They walked on, considering whether the Indians would tomahawk her for stealing Eban's own bread. Well, they'd shortly tomahawk Marah for whining, so Mercy might as well get on with it. She set the two children down, and Eban bent his knees so she could reach, and Mercy fished around in the pack. She slid the loaf out. It was long and fat and crusty. Her Indian was watching. Mercy looked straight at him while she ripped off a chunk for Marah. He did nothing. Mercy decided to give some to Jemima too, which would give her something to do besides whine. She would give bread to Eliza and hope food would break Eliza's grieving stupor. Marah didn't take a single bite. She threw the bread across the snow. "I want Mama," she said fiercely. She glared at Mercy as if all this hiking and shivering were Mercy's fault. Mercy could not abandon the bread out there in the snow. She was going to need that bread. It was all they had, and somehow Mercy had become responsible for Marah and Daniel and Ruth and Eliza and Jemima, and probably even for Eban. Mercy stepped off the trodden path to retrieve the crust, but her Indian stopped her, shaking his head. On his face was no expression but the one painted in black. His arms were tattooed with snakes that curled their fangs when he tightened his muscles. How could he go half bare in this weather, she thought, and then remembered that she wore his rabbit-lined cloak. Daniel, sitting happily on her hip, reached out from under the rabbit fur and patted the snake. The Indian tensed his upper arm to make the snake slither. Daniel giggled, so the Indian did it again, and it seemed to Mercy that he actually smiled at Daniel. Then blessedly, he took Marah for her. One child she could manage. One child was nothing. Now she would not fall behind. "Help me get Daniel on my back, Ruth." Ruth removed the Indian's cape and lifted Daniel. He dug his heels into her waist, got comfortable, and kept to suck his thumb once more. Ruth tucked the cape in and around them both, tying the hood. Invisible and toasty under the cape, Daniel gnawed on his bread. Little crumbs fell down Mercy's back. She was able to walk as fast as Eban now. They were still last in line, but not in danger. Up ahead, several children were being carried by Indians. Little Eunice Williams, the minister's youngest daughter, was actually riding on an Indian's shoulders, enjoying the strange parade because she had a comfortable seat and a fine view. Mercy's spirits actually rose. The distant hills looked like piled quilts. Her favorite psalm came back in all its beauty and truth. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my help. Faith passed through Mercy like a drink of something sweet and warm. A moment later, her Indian came up from behind, passing her and heading toward the front. He did not have Marah. Please stop here and answer question 6. It was an hour before the Indians paused again, and then they stopped so abruptly the prisoners were tripping over each other. It frightened Eban. What was going to happen? What dread plan might the Indians have for their white prisoners now? No Indian lifted a weapon. They stood motionless, looking west. Eban watched for several moments before he was able to pick out distant figures coming toward them. It was not rescue. If those were English, the Indians would long ago have surrounded and attacked them. Slowly, the shapes turned into men carrying burdens, men bent doubled under the weight, yet not staggering as Eban had. They looked as if they had killed and were carrying entire cows. They were very close before Eban realized he was seeing warriors carrying their wounded. Each man was rolled up into a package, swaddled like a baby in a blanket, and strapped to a warrior's back. These men were carrying, by their foreheads and on their spines, a weight equal to their own. Eban was awestruck. Dropping down his own pack in the snow, Eban's Indian knelt beside one of the wounded men, unwrapping bandages to examine the wound. His profile against the snow was beautiful as an eagle or a hawk is beautiful. Please stop here and answer question 7. Blessed rest. Mercy flopped onto the snow. Daniel danced around just as a 3-year-old enjoying a pretty day. Mercy closed her eyes so she could not see his happiness. She knew Marah was in the hands of the Lord. It's my fault. I didn't keep her quiet, thought Mercy, and she wept into the snow, and then, because she had so little sleep and so much horror, because she had walked so far and carried so much, Mercy fell asleep. Even in sleep, she felt extraordinarily cold. The sleep was intense and short, and she woke up to the odd sensation of somebody unlacing her shoes. I fell asleep with my shoes on, thought Mercy. Mother is taking them off for me. Mother is going to tuck me in and say my prayers for me. Sam and Benny and John and Tommy loved stories about Mother, and Mercy loved to tell them. When she knew she was dying, Mercy had pleaded with her children. "Don't forget me," she had said, her eyes filled with tears. "I will wait for you in the Lord, but don't forget me." "I will never forget you," Mercy had promised, but soon the shape of her mother's smile and the scent of her mother's hair disappeared from memory. Mostly Mercy remembered Mother by the house. Mother had had plans. Glass windows were what she wanted most. A real table, not a trestle and a slab of wood that would have to be taken down between meals to make room for other chores. Soon, Father used to tell her, smiling. She was a scholar, having read the Bible many times, and there was nothing she liked more than telling the rough and tumble stories of the Old Testament. Mother didn't get tired the way stepmama did. It was nothing for her to weave several yards of cloth in one day and also kill 2 chickens, make a stew for 10, bake bread, help a sick neighbor, write Bible verses with the boys, and show Mercy how to knit the heel of a stocking. Mother could accomplish anything, except her 6th child. She had not lived through Marah's birth. Please stop here and answer question 8. A chill penetrated. It could not be Mother untying her shoelaces. Mother had not been alive for 3 years. Mercy woke up. Her Indian, killer of Marah, was taking off her shoes. "No, no," she said, horrified. "I have to have shoes," she explained, as if his English vocabulary went this far. "I can't go barefoot. Let me keep my shoes." But he threw them out into the snow. where they skidded over the crusty surface and vanished beneath hemlock branches like two brown rabbits. On her feet, he placed deerskin slippers, lined with fur like the cloak. They tied at the ankle with tall flaps to keep her legs dry and warm. She ran a finger over intricate embroidery. She remembered Mother stitching pretty things, a white ruffle on Father's best shirt, a narrow row of lace around the pocket of Mercy's Sunday apron. The Indian pulled her to her feet, brushing the snow and ice from her neck and face, and put Daniel back in her arms. Daniel's feet had been bare, but now he too wore Indian slippers, just the right size for his little feet. The rock-hard wetness of her heavy leather boots had frozen her toes and blistered her heels, but now her feet were cozy inside the soft moccasins. She felt guilty about the others, still suffering, and then, astonished, saw that all the prisoners were being given moccasins. She and Eban Nims stared at each other. "They knew they would take this many prisoners, Eban," whispered Mercy. "They have enough moccasins to go around. They have little pairs and big pairs." She thought of them back in Canada, around their fires, among their French allies, planning how many pairs of moccasins they would need when they sacked Deerfield. "They mean us to live," thought Mercy. "But why? What will they do with all of us?" Please stop here and answer question 9. Eban's moccasins were lined with thick black fur. His boots were abandoned at the edge of a trail. Eban thought of Deerfield men getting this far in pursuit and finding 100 pairs of shoes. It made him feel slightly better at the odds of survival. People who brought enough shoes would also have considered how to feed their prisoners. 300 miles with, he guessed, 100 prisoners, 200 Indians, and somewhere, not here, perhaps 200 French. A stupefying number of people to feed. Eban tried to convince himself that the Indians had provisions waiting somewhere, but who could move enough food for hundreds of people all the way from Canada to Massachusetts? And how could that food be stored in the wilderness? If they planned to hunt down meat as they marched, they'd have to leave the prisoners to do it, and they'd have to find a lot of deer. He studied his Indian, trying to find answers in that paint-smeared face. But his Indian now carried the full weight of his wounded friend or brother. One gesture, and it was clear that Indian would carry Indian, while Eban would carry loot. Eban opened up the blankets to combine his packet with the Indian's. At the sight of his mother's dresses, Eban thought he would begin screaming, but he controlled himself. He tucked in his little sister Molly's doll as gently as Molly had every night. "Oh, Molly," he thought, willing himself not to collapse, "forgive my sin." Sarah Hoyt, watching from several paces up in the line, walked back to help, but Eban's Indian called, "No!" The syllable cut as sharply as a knife edge. Puzzled, Sarah motioned that she carried very little and she could take part of the load for Eban. "No!" One of the Kellogg boys, guessing that heavy loads were meant for men and not girls, also tried to take some of Eban's pack, but again the Indian snapped out a no. "I'm just going to carry the heavy things," Joseph Kellogg explained, "the brass kettles." The Indian's glare terrified them. Joseph stepped away, holding his hands up for peace. "I think Eban has to carry everything that belongs to his Indian," said Sarah softly. "We belong to somebody else. Stand up, Eban. Joseph and I will get the pack on your back." She and Joseph could hardly even lift the double pack, and as for the straps, they were just a jumble of leather. Eban felt Sarah trembling against him, trying to get it done right and quickly. When another Indian strode up, they cringed, but he simply fastened the pack securely. Eban wasn't sure he could take one step, never mind get to Canada. Joanna Kellogg, one of Joseph's sisters, was stumbling. For Joanna, the world blurred. Her eyes didn't focus the way other people's did. Leaves on trees were green blots against a blue sky. She couldn't recognize people until they were within a dozen paces. When an Indian brave took Joanna's hand, she had not seen her mother die, and she did not know this was her killer. She was only 10, but her pack was nearly as large as the ones grown men carried. Joanna did not complain or call out. She just walked more and more slowly. Ruth Catlin lost her temper. She flung the pack she had been given into the snow. She grabbed Joanna by the shoulders and ripped off Joanna's pack, flinging that into the snow too. She hurled an iron frying pan across the snow and then a whole leg of lamb. Indian and captives alike were mesmerized. "You savages!" Ruth screamed. "Don't you even think about hurting Joanna. She's too little. You are vicious and mean. I hate you." She dragged Joanna forward, as if the two of them meant to reach Canada first, by God. "Go ahead and kill me," she yelled, holding out her hair to be scalped. "I dare you." She made a fist around her own hair, yanked it tight, and waved the bristles in Indian faces. Nobody tomahawked Ruth. She stomped past Indian after Indian, calling them names. Ruth stormed right up to the front of the line when the lead Indians were trampling out the path. She could go no farther. The Indians politely stepped back and gestured north, making it clear that Ruth was welcome to lead the way. Ruth wildly kicked at one of the braves, but he stepped back and Ruth's burst of energy vanished. She wanted to lie down in her own soft bed, bury her face in the pillow, and weep for the family that had died around her. Even more, she wanted to kill an Indian, or 10 of them. But she had no weapon, and as for softness, even the snow was not soft today. Well, at least she would not give those Indians the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Glaring, dragging poor Joanna, she marched on. Please stop here and answer question 10. In a dark and twisted grove of spruce, a place Eban would have avoided in summer at high noon, the Indian stopped for the night. If he had ever seen a place where an evil spirit would dwell, this was it. He knelt to release the pack. His forehead was rubbed raw, and beneath his coat he was blistered from hours of friction and weight. The stab wound in his chest seemed to have deepened and widened. No food was given out. There was no shelter. The Indians did not even start a fire. "We have to have a fire," thought Eban. "We have to dry our blankets and warm our feet. They stole whole hams. Surely they'll let us have hot food." Could the Indians be worried that wood smoke would reveal where they were? No, because 300 people left a considerable trail, and that same trail was littered with bodies and shoes. Even an Englishman who had never been in the woods in his life could stroll after them by starlight. Eban decided the Indians were neglecting to make a fire just to be mean. He watched them cut spruce boughs for beds, and the scent of spruce surprised him. It was sweet and friendly in the dusk. Slowly, unthreateningly, Sarah Hoyt got to her feet. She dusted off her skirt and removed the bag she had tied to her waistband. She circled from child to child, giving each a bite of cornbread or dried apple. She must have grabbed the bag before she was thrown out of her house. The Indians did not interfere. Sarah Hoyt dropped down between Eban and Mercy. She gave a little scrap to Daniel and a crust to Mercy. 2 circles of dried apple were left for Eban. He wolfed them down before he thought to wonder if Sarah herself had eaten any. "You were wonderful, Eban," she said quietly. "I was proud of you, caring so much and not giving up, and being sure that Mercy had bread for Daniel." He had not been wonderful, but he did not explain. What was the point? Sarah had dead of her own. "My father's up front," Sarah said. "You know how they've tied the men for the night? They're staked on the ground like skins being cured. I think the temperature is below 0 again. I think they'll freeze." Eban was hurt that he was not being treated like a man. With dusk, the snow turned blue and black. The heavy spruce boughs held as much snow as the loft of a barn. In this dark hollow, nothing had melted. "We will freeze to death," thought Mercy. "Why go to all the trouble of carrying 100 pairs of moccasins when they won't make a fire?" Her Indian knelt and with his bare hands scooped out a hole in the snowbank. She expected him to store his plunder in the cavity. He had to make a lot of hand motions before she understood that this was her shelter for the night. Not a house, nor a bed, nor even a stable. A hole in the snow. Mercy wanted to raise her head to the skies and howl like a dog, but she wanted to survive. There must be no more bodies along this terrible trail. "First, may I look for my brothers?" She held up 4 fingers. "No," said the Indian, and motioned her into the cave, tucking Daniel in after her. Mercy would have felt much better if she had rested her eyes on Tommy and John and Sam and Benny. From her hole, she watched the others settle in for the night. Eban's Indian collected the older boys. Eban, the oldest Kellogg boy, the 2 Sheldon boys, and Joe Alexander, who was in his 20s but looked very young. They were pinioned to the ground a dozen yards from where Mercy was curled. For Eban, however, his Indian made a cradle of spruce boughs. He wrapped a leather rope around Eban's wrist and tied the cord to his own. If Eban moved, his captor would know it. The rest were made to lie on open snow. There was nothing between them and the weather, no walls, no roof, no parent. Daniel slept. Mercy needed to pray before she slept, but her weary mind could not locate a prayer. The sounds of the night settled into the rhythm of the breathing. People too exhausted to care where they lay. Mercy waited for stars, so she could count them, and it was a long time before she realized the forest was so deep that trees hid the sky. Lord, she prayed finally, don't go. And yet her dreams, when they came, were sun-gilt and sparkly, as if the day had been made of crystals instead of blood. In her dream it was October, and the leaves were gold. She gave a leaf to Marah, and Marah smiled. Mercy awoke sometime in the night to a whispery shuffle. No doubt an Indian guarding prowl. How careful were his steps, how slow and separate. If only it would snow. She and Daniel would be hidden in their tiny cave, forgotten while the Indians marched on, and after a while she would dig them out and run all the way home. But was there a home now? Mercy caught the edges of her mind like a hem with a needle, turning under the memory of the attack and whipping up the frayed and bleeding edges. She must not think of Deerfield. She must not picture what was left, nor what father would find when he got home. Anyhow, she could not let her brothers go to Canada alone, so even if she got the chance to escape, she couldn't take it. It occurred to Mercy that a guard would not tiptoe. Her heart soared. One of the prisoners was escaping. A load of snow tumbled off a bough, and when the limb lifted, a shaft of moonlight fell on Joe Alexander, who had been tied down next to Eban. He was creeping out of camp. Mercy prayed Joe out of sight and across the frozen ravines, prayed him back up and over every hill, prayed him safely to Deerfield, and then, thought Mercy, the Indians will kill somebody in revenge. Eban probably. He was closest. They'll know that he knew. Please stop here and answer question 11.